The story begins in a quiet town, the kind that only makes the news when something strange or violent disturbs the routine silence. On the surface, it was a place like many others, neighbors nodding at one another, shopkeepers sweeping their storefronts at dawn, church bells marking time as predictably as the seasons. Beneath that surface, though, resentment had been brewing for years, unnoticed or deliberately ignored. It was in that atmosphere that the story of the so-called underdog took root and later spread like wildfire through whispers, police files, and headlines. He had always been the boy no one expected much from. Small, wiry, and quiet, he blended into the background at school and later at work. People remembered his face only vaguely, describing him as that kid who never spoke up, or the guy who worked in the corner office. What was his name again? He had a gift for vanishing into the noise of life, but invisibility came at a cost. For years, he was the target of jokes, ridicule, and worse. Bullies found him easy prey, supervisors dismissed him, and even friends often used him more than they valued him. Each humiliation stacked neatly on top of the last, like stones building a wall. What no one saw was how carefully he was keeping count. The town's golden sons were the opposite of him. Loud, confident, admired. They excelled at sports, at business, at every public measure of success. The underdog's name was rarely mentioned beside theirs, unless as a punchline. Among them, one stood taller than the rest, a man who had built himself into something of a local hero. He owned a successful construction firm, gave generously to charities, and seemed untouchable. He was also, as it turned out, the one who had hurt the underdog most profoundly years earlier. That betrayal, sharp, humiliating, and permanent, had lingered in the shadows of memory. Time passed, but the underdog did not forget. What looked like endurance to others was, in truth, calculation. He studied, he waited, he grew sharper. He watched the town's hero rise higher and higher, and with each headline, each new accolade, the bitterness twisted deeper. By the time whispers of shady dealings began to surface about the construction empire, bribes, mistreatment of workers, buried debts, the underdog was already prepared. He had been gathering fragments of truth for years, small, overlooked details no one else had bothered to notice. The reckoning, when it came, did not explode but unfolded slowly, like a fuse burning toward its end. Documents surfaced anonymously in the mailroom of a local paper. Anonymous tips slipped into the hands of investigators. What began as rumor hardened into evidence, contracts altered, safety inspections forged, funds siphoned into accounts that led nowhere. The hero, who had towered above the town, was suddenly drowning under accusations, dragged into courtrooms where his charm could not shield him. The underdog never appeared in public, never raised his voice to claim credit, but the whispers spread. People began piecing things together, his long silence, his watchful presence, the way he had seemed invisible until suddenly he wasn't. Some called him a vigilante, others a criminal in his own right. The files he released did not just expose corruption, they also ruined reputations, destroyed families, and left scars on those only distantly connected. By the end of it, the so-called hero was no more. Stripped of wealth, locked away, his legacy burned to ash. The town looked different in the aftermath, no longer held together by illusions, but fractured, suspicious, wary. And yet, beneath all the fallout, there was a strange admiration for the man who had orchestrated it. He was no longer invisible. The newspapers wrestled with how to frame it. Was he a criminal, driven by bitterness and vengeance? Or was he a kind of hero, the underdog who finally struck back at the corruption of power? Headlines danced around the contradiction, calling it revenge and justice in the same breath. Even now, no one quite agrees which it was. But the underdog never explained himself. He simply vanished again, leaving the town to argue over the wreckage, leaving his story suspended between triumph and tragedy. The question he left behind still lingers unanswered. Was this the revenge of a bitter man, or the justice of a quiet hero who refused to stay silent any longer? And in that silence, the story continues to grow, retold in cafes and living rooms, each voice shaping him into what they need him to be, a villain, a savior, or something in between. The story didn't end with the fall of the town's so-called hero. In fact, that was only the first tremor of something much larger. Once the dust of the trial had settled, once reporters had filed their stories and the community began the slow work of rebuilding its reputation, people started asking harder questions. How had so much corruption been allowed to spread in plain sight? Who else had looked the other way? Who had benefited? The Underdog had made sure those questions couldn't be ignored. His leaks weren't just precise, they were surgical, cutting into the exact places where denial was impossible. For every forged inspection he exposed, there was a worker who remembered the day corners were cut. For every falsified ledger, there was a bank clerk who suddenly saw the numbers for what they really were. The evidence didn't just topple one man, it unraveled a network. But vengeance is a dangerous tool, and it rarely cuts in only one direction. The town became paranoid, whispering about who might be next. Some suspected the Underdog was still watching, still compiling lists, waiting for another strike. Others feared he had already handed over evidence that hadn't yet come to light. Old allies turned on one another. Politicians who had once smiled for photos with the disgraced businessman suddenly found themselves distancing, denying, rewriting their own histories. And through it all, the Underdog stayed silent. He didn't claim his victory publicly, didn't step forward to be praised or condemned. Some said he left town altogether. Others swore they saw him still, slipping in and out of the library late at night, head down, eyes averted. His invisibility, once a curse, had become his greatest weapon. He could be anywhere, and the possibility was enough to keep people unsettled. The media seized on the mystery. Documentaries were pitched, podcasts launched, and sensational headlines kept circling. The Underdog Avenger? A small town's shadowy whistleblower? Hero or criminal? True crime enthusiasts debated endlessly online. Was this justice carried out by a courageous insider, or was it just an elaborate vendetta dressed up as morality? The truth, of course, was both. There were moments, tucked away in the testimonies and reports, that revealed the human cost of his plan. A secretary who lost her job when the firm collapsed. Families who had relied on steady paychecks suddenly left scrambling. Even those untouched by the scandal lived under a cloud of suspicion, wondering if their own small sins might someday be exposed. Revenge may have righted one wrong, but it also sowed a dozen new wounds. And yet, there was a darker irony. In tearing down the man who had defined his life for so long, the Underdog also defined himself. No longer overlooked, he became a legend of sorts, though not the kind sung about in songs or written about in textbooks. His legacy was whispered in alleyways, debated in classrooms, immortalized in crime blogs. He had finally forced the world to see him, though not in the way heroes usually are. The townsfolk, when pressed, still split down the middle. Some insisted he was the only one brave enough to fight corruption when no one else dared. Others argued that his motives had nothing to do with justice, that he simply wanted to see his enemy ruined. Perhaps both were true. Perhaps justice and revenge aren't opposites at all, but cousins, walking hand in hand until it no longer matters where one ends and the other begins. And so his story remains unfinished, because the Underdog never wrote the final chapter himself. He disappeared, leaving only wreckage and questions. His silence is the sharpest cut of all, forcing everyone else to decide what he was: a bitter man who struck back at the world that scorned him, or a hidden hero who proved that power could be broken by patience and persistence. Some say the story is still unfolding, that he's not finished, that his files and evidence stretch far beyond that one fallen man. And in the quiet moments, when people feel they're being watched, they sometimes wonder if the Underdog is still there, invisible as always, still counting, still waiting for the right moment to act again.